Get ready to roll. Let me make. So, we have the Fredonian Revolt, where about 30 guys were able to take over Nacogdoches and proclaim it Fredonia, expecting a lot of people to rush to them. Nobody does. They leave. But guys, this makes Mexico incredibly scared as to what is going on here in Texas. So in 1828, General Manuel Mier y Terán, soldier, scholar, and statesman, was sent to observe the eastern boundary and to investigate the need for military posts up in Texas. And his report went way beyond this. He presented a detailed description of Texas and recommendations for policy changes because he was alarmed. He noted how Mexican influence decreased rapidly the further east you get away from San Antonio, all the way up into Nacogdoches. And in Nacogdoches, the Mexican population was small and poor compared to the Anglo-American settlers. These settlers he described as including slaveholders, honest laborers, criminals, and vagabonds. They were possessive, unruly, and demanding. Huron felt that Mexico had to act now to stop this, or Texas would be lost forever. And how? So what changes are we going to make? Well, basically, Terán proposed that Mexicans should colonize Mexicans in Texas, bring in Swiss and German settlers, encourage coastal trade between Texas and the rest of the Republic, and place more troops in Texas. Among them, the convict soldiers, who would then become permanent settlers when their terms had expired. Now, Terán returned in his report as early as June and July of 1828, but Mexico was going through political upheaval, which delayed action for almost 2 years, because in September of 1828, conservative Gomez Pedraza was elected. The military doesn't like him, so there's an uprising, and Vicente Guerrero stops him from taking office. And in the spring of 1829, Guerrero, who was a Federalist, takes office. He uses the chaos that had been he uses the chaos that's all around him to basically assume dictatorial powers. And on September 15th, 1829, he issued a proclamation ending slavery throughout the nation. Now, nationally in Mexico, it didn't cause a lot of attention, except for Texas. Texas protested vigorously, and due to the intervention of Mexican leaders in San Antonio, we were excluded. So guys, remember, the Tejanos are just as important to making Texas what it was as were the Anglo-Americans. That's basically when slavery was ended. Oh, and by the way, if y'all think that Texas revolted specifically to keep slavery, you're wrong. If you'd like to read a really good book where the guy totally tries to argue, and I mean, he is good. His argument is good. It's solid. Boom, boom. It's Paul Lax. Oh boy, I forgot the name of the book. I know the name of the author. Anyway, Lax tries to prove throughout the whole book that it was all about slavery, but it all falls apart at the end, and he's not able to tie his thesis together. Shortly after this, there's a centralist coup d'etat. It throws out Guerrero and installs Anastasio Bustamante. And Bustamante is serious about checking Anglo-American influence in Texas. Lucas Alman, his Minister of Foreign Relations, urged Congress to take Tehran's proposals and indeed go beyond them. In one of the articles, Article 11, colonists from a country directly adjacent to Mexico were forbidden. So in other words, no more colonists from America. And any impresario contract that hadn't been fulfilled were to be dissolved. Military posts were to be established, and the importation of slaves was to end. Now in Mexico, this seemed to make perfect sense. Uh-oh. I guess I'll go back here. Like I was about to say, to Mexico. Where was I? Yeah, to Mexico, this seemed like to make perfect sense. Meanwhile, to the colonials in Texas, it was a calamity. Austin and Green DeWitt were able to use an interpretation of the law to continue colonization. Indeed, the population in Austin's colony actually increased from 4,248 in June of 1830 to 5,663 a year later. So he was pretty crafty, and he, as well as his Tejano allies, continued to try to put pressure to get a repeal of the law of April 6, 1830, done away with. The continuation of colonization. Now, although the law of April 6, 1830 slowed colonization, it didn't stop it. I mean, non-U.S. citizens were not harassed, and in some instances, the law was either disregarded or ignored. Other efforts were made to evade it. For example, Lorenzo de Zavala, he would become our vice president during our ad interim government. Joseph Velheim and David G. Burnett joined their East Texas holdings and turned it into the Galveston Bay and Texas Land Company that they handed over to a New York-based company to advertise and attract settlers. This company first sent 2 groups of immigrants to Texas, but the Mexican authorities didn't allow them to settle. But eventually the Mexican authorities acquiesced and let them in. And between September of 1834 and December of 1835, a stream of immigrants received a total of 936 titles of land in the area north of Galveston Bay. Did you get a thing to wipe off your desk? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you. Another curious case was with the Robertson colony. This was land tracts that were north of Austin's tracts. And Sterling C. Robertson was their impresario. And it had been given to him in 1825. He'd made very little initial progress, And after the passage of the law of April 6th, he pretty much has to consider closing his contract. But in 1831, the land was granted to Austin and his partner Samuel Williams. They tried to bring in and attract Mexican and European settlers. Robertson fought against this, which led to a land battle that lasted for decades afterwards. But the Mexican governor of Texas saw that Robertson had successfully settled 100 families, so he gave the contract back to Robertson. But Austin and Williams regained the colony in May of the following year. Then we have the revolution. That throws everything akimbo. And it's not settled until 1847, when the Texas courts ruled that Robertson's claims to the colony were valid, and his heirs were awarded premium land for 379 families that were brought into Texas. Now, what about foreigners? I've already told you about Lorenzo de Zavala, not Lorenzo de Zavala, jeez Louise, he was from Yucatan. Martin de Leon, the guy who started Victoria, the Mexican impresario. Well, we got two Irish impresarios. On August 8th of 1828, John McMullen and his son-in-law James McGoyne, that were both natives of Ireland, but they had become merchants in Matamoros. They received permission to settle 200 Irish families in a portion of the country near the Nueces River. They started out with 58 settlers who had arrived. And wrong one. Yeah, 58 settlers that arrived in late 1829, and by October of 1831, they had established San Patricio as their colony's central town. Meanwhile, James Power and James Hewitson got a contract to settle 200 families from Mexico and Ireland. Power went to Ireland in 1834, returning to Texas with 350 immigrants, but sadly a lot of them contracted cholera, and the survivors were forced to swim to shore, carrying all their belongings. And what kind of becomes their capital city is Refugio. And by the time of the Texas Revolution, they had issued more than 200 land titles. Indeed, during the Mexican War, San Patricio actually rose up the Green Battalion that fought for Mexico. Any of y'all ever been down to San Patricio? You really, really have to drive and want to get there to get there. But it's an interesting town. The people of Mexican Texas. In 1834, the Mexican soldiers and statesman Juan Almonte placed the population of Texas at 21,000. This was including slaves. Census takers from 1831 to 1833 placed the Tejano population, which of course excluded military personnel, at about 4,000. And some have exerted that the population was as large as 30,000. Now, if Almonte's overall numbers were true, that would mean that the population had about 15,000 Anglos, 4,000 Tejanos, and about 2,000 slaves.
I save for information that I don't go without for too long.
You can watch this again on because I'll have it uploaded. Oh, by the way, guys, I'll put up a kind of weekly update tomorrow when I put up the video file of this, telling y'all your quiz review for Monday, what you need to know from this. Also, I'll put up when your class is going to be meeting next week. Y'all, I'm only going to have you on Wednesday. You'll have a thought question due on that day. Okay. And like I said, I'll tell you what you need to know for the quiz. Okay? Yeah.
Are the thought questions going to follow the same format where you just select one of the group to do usually, or are you going to have sometimes a few more?
I might just say do them all because you're only doing one thing and you're getting 2 points. But it seems like, and I hate just making it 2 points, but I hate having grades that are like out of 1,000 points. If you have 900 to 100, it's like, no, I like to keep it. So I might ask 2 questions. I don't know. Or, yeah, to answer 2. Or you can choose to, but I'll see what I want to do. All right, so first off, people of Mexican Texas. First we'll talk about the Tejano communities. And predominantly Tejano communities changed greatly during this time. Like San Antonio actually declined in population, while Tejanos in the Nacogdoches areas rose from a little more than 100 in 1823 to more than 600 by 1834. And Goliad and Victoria, they also grew from about 500 Tejanos to about 2,000 during that same period of time. Now, how come San Antonio is going down in Tejano population? That's because a lot of the Tejanos that were living in San Antonio are now going out and founding ranches. They're going out and trying to make money. And the reason why Nacogdoches was growing so much is because there was so much trade going on with America. Texas, as a Mexican state, barely traded with Mexico. But it traded a lot with America. You ready for the next one? Okay, immigrants from the U.S. counted for most of the population growth during this time period. Generous land policies encouraged immigration, and on the eve of revolution, most of the immigrants lived east of Guadalupe and south of the old road from San Antonio to Nacogdoches. Together, these settlers had about 3,500 land titles through different impresarios. Now, who were these immigrants? Well, mainly they were farmers and people of some means, although I'm not going to lie, many had left debts behind that they couldn't pay. They were honest and law-abiding for the most part. Indeed, their literacy rates were high. Out of Austin's old 300, 266 out of the original old 300, 266 could read and write, and only 4 couldn't write. Also, another striking thing was the number of women that were included. Most came in the company of their husbands and families, but some braved the dangers and hardships of the frontier alone. Indeed, Austin's colonies reported in 1830 about 20 widows. Where'd they come from? Well, most of the guys who settled in Texas came from the southern states. The majority of the Austin's people came from Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, Missouri now. But there was a total of about 699 that were from the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. Everybody got it? Now, a significant portion of the population were slaves, about 10%. Now, this is despite repeated attempts in both Mexican law and policy to discourage and even ban slavery. Like Iturbide's imperial colonization law and Texas's Coahuila immigration law recognized slavery and permitted the introduction of slaves for up to 6 months. But as Mexico continued to make slavery and slave ownership more and more difficult, loopholes were created to allow slavery to continue. For example, in when they outlawed slavery, well, Tejas tried to get around that by making it legal for someone to sell their services for life to their master. But then in 1832, a law was passed that said, okay, it limited colonization, that contract period of labor to only 10 years. As y'all remember, Iturbide's colonization law said that slaves could be brought in, but their children, once they got past 14, they were free. Now, believe it or don't, the slave population per ratio actually had dropped in Austin's colony. In 1825, there were 443 slaves and 1,347 free settlers. Yet in Juan Almonte's report of 1834, there was about 1,000 slaves out of a free population of 10,000. And also, you had about 150 free blacks that lived in Texas during Mexican rule. One example would be the Ashworth family that lived near Nueces. Other free blacks might have been farmers. One notable free black is William Goyens of Nacogdoches, who was an entrepreneur and businessman who held interests in a sawmill, a grist mill, as well as an inn. As we'll talk about a little later on, he was in charge of Indian relations in East Texas during our revolution. And sadly, after our revolution, when we become a republic, they passed a law saying the free blacks couldn't live in Texas unless they got special permission from legislation or from the governor, and William Williams got that permission. I was about to say effortlessly, but did have to work a little at it. And his wife got, even after we became a state, his wife got a pension for his services. Government in Mexican Texas. Now guys, y'all are probably going to get out early today. I had the volume on so I know when 10:45 was, so I could pass out the attendance. This is going to be real short because I didn't feel like going through all of the different ayuntamiento and all the different offices. Just know that San Antonio was the most influential settlement in Tejas. I mean, it was our capital city. You had Tejanos like Jose Antonio Navarro, and government officials like our political chief or governor, Ramon Musquiz, who pled for Texas in distant Saltillo. You had the brothers Jose and Augustinian Vizca that were effective advocates for the liberal factions in politics. And by the way, guys, when we talk about liberal here, that means freedom. This is the classical definition of liberal, which means freedom from government. The modern classical definition of liberal is freedom through government. Totally different. Oh, wait a minute. I left out a whole deal. All right, let me include this whole deal. I'll just do it here. Now, what was driving the people to come to Texas?
Opportunity, promise of free land.
Not a promise of incredible deal with land. A lot of them were trying to escape from the panic of 1819 up in the U.S. Some of them came to regain their health. Some of them came to drown out their sorrows. Some came to try to begin their lives anew. But in talking about the land, in the U.S., somebody could buy no less than, you had to buy all 80 acres together, and it would cost you $1.25 an acre. That's a total of about $1,000, and it had to be cash on hand. You had to do it right then. In Texas, one could obtain 4,428 acres for just $30 down, and then after 4 years, you'd have to start paying off the other 120. But it was incredible how much more land you could get here in Texas. Meanwhile, back to the government. Basically, for local governments, Mexican government and culture was modified and blended to fit into the Americans' patterns. The most important government was the municipality, which included one or more towns that might cover thousands of miles. And the biggest threat that the government might help protect you from, especially the local government, was natives. Harassing Stephen F. Austin's colonies were the Karankawas. The Tonkawas and Wacos harassed a little bit of Stephen F. as well as Green DeWitt's colonies. The Cherokee and the Choctaws were much more peaceful up in East Texas and all along the frontier. I mean, were the Comanche. And these guys were such fierce warriors, they struck fear into the American capital of United States, at Washington, D.C., as much as they struck fear into the Mexican capital at Mexico City. Well, how are we going to deal with the Native Americans, especially the Comanche? Well, Stephen F. Austin basically took from the Spanish what the Spanish did with their flying squadrons and basically utilized mounted cavalry militias. First one was formed in 1822, and by 1824 he had 6 such militia groups. Now, does anybody know what the generic name for these militia groups were? They rode out on the range and were from Texas, that whole Texas range thing. Anybody know what group may have evolved out of this?
I don't know that it was at that point yet, but the Texas Rangers, I presume?
Yeah, basically this is the founding of what would become later on the Texas Rangers. That's what they grew out of. Now, the problems for Green DeWitt, especially against the Tonkawas, who basically burned his capital city of Gonzales to the ground 1 year after he had founded it, he told Mexico, look, you've got to help me out, provide me military assistance, or my colony is going to be able to make it 1 more year. So in 1831, they give him a cannon that had been spiked. I mean, it wasn't really any good as a cannon, but it made a loud noise, which would scare the Native Americans. I actually made a documentary about that, but we're not at that point yet. I'll let y'all have access to it. You can see it if you want. Ready to go to the next one? Colonial institutions. Now guys, religion was very important. Well, it was very important for most people back then. But in Mexico, Roman Catholicism was the religion of the state to the exclusion of any other. And the priest at San Antonio was a very, very wealthy man. But he didn't go out and proselytize and try to get more members much. And while Austin did inform his colonists of their need to become Roman Catholic, because nobody really bothered them about it, as his colony grew, he became less adamant about it. Even though Austin did send several requests for a priest, basically this was done so that like children could be baptized, that weddings could be held, that there could be funerals. So he gets the assistance. In 1831, Mexico sends him an Irish priest by the name of Michael Muldoon. Now, Michael Muldoon, his father had been Irish, and he'd gotten into a fight with a British soldier. And because of that, he had to hustle buck out of Ireland. He went down to Spain, married a Spanish woman. They had young Miguel, or Michael. And when Michael grows up, he is a priest. He hears of the Mexican Revolution. He says, that's where I gotta be. He goes to Mexico. And now he's up here in Texas to be the representative for Austin's colony. And basically, he was very kind and fiercely loyal, but very light-handed with his enforcement of Catholicism. Liked to comply with the dictates that all of the colonists had to be Catholic. He basically lined up the colonists, and in an assembly line fashion, he would induct them into the Catholic Church, basically making making them what was called Muldoon Catholics. Now, he did care a lot for his people, so much so that one time there was an attack and a woman and her children were kidnapped by the Comanche. He went out by himself to try to negotiate for their release. And when he gets out there, he finds out that the kids are dead, but he is able to get the release of the woman and bring her back. Now, of course, you did have some Protestants that arrived, like as early as 1820. A Baptist minister, Joseph Bays, was preaching in Texas. You also had like William Stevenson, a Methodist preacher, who preached despite warnings from Stephen Austin and others. And just like you had in the American West, where you would have the revival week and those kind of camp meetings, Protestant camp meetings also were throughout the colonies here in Texas. Basically in education, even though Mexico had passed a law saying that there had to be public schools in every settlement, the only places that really had public schools were San Antonio, that built one way early on in the 1700s, but it had kind of fallen into disrepair. You also had one at Nacogdoches, as well as San Augustine. And for Austin's colony, a private school had opened. Meanwhile, in commerce and trade, by 1832, Brazoria had become the largest point of shipping, because they hadn't really developed Galveston. Matagorda Bay still need more development as well. And Nacogdoches also grew into a huge business center. Now, of course, remember, guys, we don't have a lot of cash, so a lot of Texans barter, which is, hey, I'll trade you this for that. Oh, okay, I'll trade you that for this. Oh, and by the way, also barter is still the only form of stuff that no taxes can be applied to. That's why there are some real rich people that are like, hey, I'll trade you my beach house in Maui for the beach house you have over in Florida. As long as they're about the same value, it's totally legal and it can be done without taxes. Now, most of the trade, as I said, was done with either Natchitoches in Louisiana or New Orleans. So, guys, as I was saying, the interstate trade where we're funneling back down into Mexico, it ain't happening. Most of our trade is international. Okay.